Hello, this is Uncle Sam from Kotu.org, and today we want to talk a bit about the spline tool. This is part one of a tutorial series about the spline tool. In all these three parts we are going to cover pretty much all aspects of the spline tool in detail. And since this is such a rich topic, we have to divide it into parts. I've already said we've got three parts, and this first part is going to be about texture splines. Well, before I go into the details, I want to spend a few words about the spline tool itself. What is a spline? Give some general information about how to use the tool itself. Then, after we've covered these general informations, I'll go into the topic about spline modifications. How can I edit a spline? How can I modify its shape, its orientation, etc.? And give a few details about this. And after this, in the end, I'll briefly talk about the colorize edit, which is one of the most essential edit options of a texture spline. And this is approximately the outline of this first part of the spline tool. So let's jump right into the first chapter of this part one, general information. The spline tool, I would say, is one of the most versatile tools of Worldbuilder at all, because it combines many things. We've got different modes. We've got texture mode, we've got object mode, we've got deform mode, and we can edit all these modes at any time. We can combine them. So the spline tool is a very versatile mode, which many people, I think, have difficulties to learn in detail or to understand how powerful it actually is. Because much easier or more intuitive for beginners it might be to, for example, put down a splat or paint a texture with the tile tool than to use the spline tool for the same thing. And even more so for objects, it might be much more intuitive to place the objects immediately using the object placement tool instead of using a spline tool to do the same task. But the thing I hope you will learn from this tutorial now is to understand the power of the tool and when to use the spline tool over the more special or specialized tools in Worldbuilder. So let's go to Worldbuilder and check out the spline tool. The spline tool is selected in the top menu bar here. It's the one that shows this black road icon. And when we select the spline tool and go all the way up here in the second toolbar, we'll see that there are different modes, which I've already announced in the introduction part. We've got textures, we've got objects, and we've got deform splines. And this part of the tutorial is about texture splines. So we select this texture spline. And before I go into this texture spline further, I want to first cover what a spline actually is. So just take texture, I'll go into this more in detail later, and place some points on the map here. So now I've got these points, 5 of them. I need at least 4 to place it, and they're connected by lines. And now a spline is somewhat polynomial regression, which calculates the curve through these points or close to these points with the least variation from their locations. So if I now hit enter to place the spline, you'll notice that it's not a direct connection to the points that I put on the map, but it's some interpolation of these points. So what I've used here is now a road, and this is certainly the most intuitive thing to use the spline tool for, to paint roads. But of course you can also use different textures. Now before I go further, I want to explain first of all how to place a texture and choose a texture. So we've decided we want to place a texture spline like this. the thing we do now is we have to go down here to the texture submenu of the texture spline tool, and then I'll collapse all these folders first. This is how it looks from the very beginning. We've got here in a folder structure all different kinds of textures which we can use for the spline tool. And yeah, I'll just pick, like I did before, the rolled asphalt folder and pick a specific texture for road. Now I can select them just from here from the list without having a great idea of what the texture looks like, but I can also uncollapse this submenu, this texture preview, and I get an idea of how this texture looks like. So I can browse through them in the list, pick one that looks somewhat like what I want, and once I've selected this texture in the list, I can now place the spline by right-clicking on the map, place the points that I want to have the spline go through roughly, and then when I've placed these points, I hit enter, and this places the texture. Now if I think, okay, this is not the road texture I want to go with, I rather want, say, this one, then I can replace the texture of an existing spline by just selecting the spline with the left mouse button, choose the new texture, and hit the assign button to assign it to the spline that I've selected. Now this might also not look like what I wanted to, so I just go back to this one again. Another thing is that these textures have an optimum width associated to them. You don't have to use it, but for example for a road it looks the most sharp, and of course the texture has been chosen with a width that makes sense for a road. So in order to choose this preset width for a spline, I go all the way up to the shape submenu, and I may choose this button, set to optimum width, and this now changes the width of the spline which I've just placed to its optimum value. This is where the texture looks the most sharp. I may also have to somewhat fix the tiling whenever I change the width, because this is another important factor. So in this case I've changed it. I just hit fix tiling to width. It's the most easiest way. Of course I can pick other values like say 100, but this might not look like it should be, and the easiest way to do this is just to go with the fixed tiling to width. Instead of choosing the optimum value, I may also go with some presets which are available here from this drop-down menu with preset. I've got presets for dirt roads, footpaths, metropolitan roads, rural roads, sidewalks. So instead of choosing the optimum value here, I might have as well chosen this rural preset for roads, and instead of choosing the optimum width, I now have to press the set to preset width. This would now change the width of my spline to this preset, but you'll notice the difference is not big. So if I toggle it, you'll notice it's already almost the correct width if I go with one of these presets. So if I don't know the exact optimum width of a spline before, and I know I want to paint a road, it's also a good way to just pick one of these presets. Okay, so these are more or less the basic informations I could give about the spline tool. What is a spline? How do I place a spline, and how do I choose a texture for a spline? Now, if we go back to the overview, in the next point, I want to cover spline modification. I'll do this again directly in Worldbuilder. So I've got my spline here, and I position it to a position which is not exactly where I want it to be. So I have to edit it, or say I made a change to my map and the road has to go slightly different path. Instead of deleting the spline and placing it all over again from the start, I can also just edit these points which I've originally placed by activating the node editing mode with a spacebar. So I've hit the spacebar, and now I see here I can select all these nodes which I've placed before, and I can now just move them, and by this say adjust the position of the path to my new map. And approving this change by hitting the spacebar again, I am now done with this. Another thing I could do is to change the width of this spline more precisely. Say I don't have a road but some rubble and I wanted to cover a specific path or so. I can change the whole width of the spline instead of using these presets by holding down the Shift key on your keyboard and the right mouse button on your mouse, and then move the mouse up and down to adjust the width of the spline. I'll just let loose those buttons and the editing is done. Now I go back to the optimum value. Another thing is I might want to change the rotation of this spline. I can do this also by holding down the Shift key on your keyboard, holding down the left mouse button this time, and again move your mouse up and down while holding down these two buttons. Let loose those buttons and the editing is done. So these are some quick editing ways to adjust a spline to a new position or whatever you need without having to replace it completely from the beginning. Now another thing which I want to say is, I go back to something that I've prepared here, is sometimes you have two splines which are going to be on top of each other, like for example this road and these tracks. Of course I want to move these tracks on the road. Oops, now I've of course already have the default thing I want to have, but anyway, so I've got these tracks I want to have on the road, and you see when I move them they might not be shown on top of the road but below the road. This of course is not what I want to have. So how do I fix the stacking order of splines? Is we select them both either by clicking in a location where they overlap, or by choosing one spline, holding down the Shift key, moving the mouse on top of the second spline so that it blinks up, and then selecting it with the left mouse button. So now I've got both splines selected, and by using the page up and page down keys, I can now change the stacking order of splines. And by this, I can now put these tracks on top of the road spline I've used here. So this is another thing that might be important for several splines on top of each other. Now if I've got a spline selected, you'll also notice that I've got these editing options down here available. I want to talk mainly about these mirror texture on X or Y axis. This is something you might need when you have a road, so like this one, and you have a spline like this for the edge of the road, and you'll notice, okay, now the grass side of this road edge is towards the road and the stone side is away from the road. I can now fix this by just mirroring the spline on X-axis. So one thing this might be useful for is I've got this one, I want the same thing on the other side, so I hold down the C key for copying, drag this one to create a copy, quickly rotate this one on on the X-axis and do the same thing for the second side, without having to use or place another spline by hand. I just create a copy, flip it, and that's it. Other times where these orientations might be important is when illumination plays an important role. Say for example for this stones over here. I'll zoom in a bit to make it more clear. You'll notice we've got these stones here which cast shadow to give it some 3D look, and this shadow casting is performed or created by a normal map and specular map, glossiness map. So basically some texture additions or additional textures which are put on top of the diffusive texture of a spline. You then don't have to know the details about this, but what is important is that these normal maps and also specular maps are they are sensitive to its orientation with respect to the light source. So to demonstrate this, I select this spline and flip it on the y-axis. You already notice that not only does the texture flip, but also the shadow is still on the same side and it looks somewhat off. If I also flip with the other side to the y-axis, you'll notice it looks completely different than it should. So when placing some splines like these, like rocks, rubble, and this kind of stuff, you'll also have to make sure that the orientation of the texture with respect to the light source is correct. So pick it correctly again, like this, so it looks natural. And yeah, just to demonstrate that illumination also plays an important role for the orientation of a texture. So we've covered now stacking, we've covered orientation, and all this. So far I've only given you modifications which act on the whole spline at the same time. Now sometimes, for example, this width modification which I showed, you don't want to have this uniformly, but you want to have these modifications applied to just some certain points of your spline. One of these examples I've prepared here. Where is it? Over here. Like for example this cliff. If you look at this, you'll notice here it goes up, here it's got its maximum height, and here it goes down again. And now if I want to place a grass edge at this cliff like this, looks already good, and some stones and rubble, dirt below like this, then yeah, it might look okay here in the middle part, but at the edges, like here, or even more so over here, you'll notice that the dirt or these stones go much too far away from this edge. You want them to stay somewhere here, but don't go all the way up here because it doesn't look right. So you might want to make this spline thinner over here, keep its width in the middle, and thinner over here. So basically I want to edit individual nodes of this spline. We've already learned how to activate these nodes by hitting the spacebar. Now I can apply all the changes I've shown you before just to individual nodes by selecting them directly. And now say I want to change the width. I hold down the shift button, or the shift key on my keyboard. I hold down the right mouse button and move the width just of this particular spline, as I would have done before to the whole spline uniformly. Now I choose this node, I adjust the width as well, do the same over here, make it smaller or thinner here as well. Hit the space button to unselect the nodes again, and if you now look, this looks much more like it should. So here you see the rubble is closer to the edge, here as well, and the whole thing looks much more like it should. Alright, so coming back to the overlay or to the outline, I've now given you information about how to modify a spline to your needs by changing individual nodes or changing the width of a spline, change its orientation, flip the orientation, etc. Now the last thing I want to cover in this tutorial is the colorize option for textures. So we go back to Worldbuilder and I go back to my road, just demonstrated on the road. I've got my road here and I find the colorize option down here on the right side. Texture edit mode, colorize. I hit this button and a new menu appears up here in the dialog box called colorize. Now first of all I want to explain what the options in this menu are. I've got two bars, bottom bar, top bar over here. The bottom bar is responsible for the alpha channel of the texture, so it's responsible for its transparency, and the top bar is responsible for tint change, so the color of the texture. Say I pick, first let me say I can also choose specific points of the spline now by choosing specific points inside this bar. So this is the far left end of the spline, this is the middle, and this is the right or the end of the spline, so to say. So if I want to change something in the middle, I can create a new point here by left clicking inside here. It creates a new point for the alpha and color channel, and say I want to reduce the opacity of the spline in its center, like here. I can now frame this point over here by 2 more points, choose the center one, reduce the alpha channel, apply the change, and you'll notice that here in the center now we've got localized a low opacity of the spline. This might be interesting, say if you'll create some crossing point over here, or you'll want to have some tracks which exit the road here to some stony road, and you want to have a smooth transition, or you want to have this road walk over a river and want to blend out the road in the part where the river is crossing, all this kind of stuff. Now I also can modify the color of my road. Say I pick this node over here and I want to change, for whatever reason, the color of my road to somewhat a red tint. Then I select this point, I pick a color over here, I can change the saturation, or actually the darkness of this color by this bar or this slider more or so. And when I apply this change, I don't know why it doesn't show so dominantly. Oh, of course, because I didn't select the spline. I'm now colorizing something but not the spline. So I select the spline, pick the point, choose a red color, and apply the change. So now it's getting red here, make this point red as well, and you'll notice that the tint of our texture is now changed to black. Red, of course. So I've learned that I can change the opacity and the color of my spline for specific regions on the spline by selecting specific points on these bar and change the color, tint, and the alpha channel. Now I can also remove these points by right-clicking on them to undo some of these changes or get rid of one of these points. Another thing I can do is say I want to have the left side look the same as the right side. So I can select this point here, hit copy, select this point and hit paste to give it the same color and the same opacity as the starting point on the other end of the spline. So apply this change. Of course I didn't select the spline again, so I've got to redo it. Copy, paste, apply. And yeah, this is how I edit an individual spline. Now sometimes I want to apply the same change which I have applied to one spline to another spline. Say I want to have the same color, tint and opacity of this spline applied to a second one. I can move it maybe even further and say this was the one I want to go with, and by selecting now all these nodes at the same time and hitting copy, it will now create a copy of all these nodes, and now I can go to this to a second road, so to say this one, and apply this colorize by choosing the colorize menu again and pasting it. Now one thing you notice is that only those points that I selected for copying are now positioned into this colorize option of the new road, but points like these two which have not been part at the same location in the previous spline which I copied are also present. So I have to make sure that either I get rid of these by just right-clicking on them, or in my previous spline I have the positions of these reference points at the same position as on the ones of the new spline where I want to apply these copy-paste option. So accept this, and now I see I've got the same color option on this road as I have on this road. Yeah, and with this I want to come to an end. I've talked enough for this first part. I've given you an introduction to the spline itself. What is a spline? It's just an interpolation between points to form a smooth transition through them. I've shown you how to pick textures for texture splines, how to change these textures, how to modify the orientation or the pathway of a spline, and in the end I've also given you a brief introduction to the colorize option of texture splines, which is very powerful, say for putting some rubble or road on top of grass, and you might want to give it a green tint for this, or putting some road on mud where you want to give it a brown tint, etc. So these are some applications of the colorize tool. And yeah, I hope to see you in the second part of this tutorial series, where I will talk about the object splines. So if you should have further questions to any of the specific steps in this tutorial, please ask these questions in the tutorial thread on code2.org. I'll link to this thread in the description of the YouTube video. Just ask and write them down in this thread, and I or one of the other map makers will respond as soon as possible. Thank you for your time.